Hi, everybody who's just joined us. Thank you so much. Welcome to this webinar from RE100 and sponsored by Enel Green Power. We're going to give our attendees a few more minutes to come on in and get logged on, and we'll get started in just a minute or two. Thank you. Hi, everybody who just joined us. This is the RE100 webinar looking at member companies who have achieved 100% in the United States. We're just going to give folks a few more minutes to get logged on, and we'll get started in just a minute or two. Thank you. Great. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks to everyone who's just been joining over the last couple minutes. Welcome to this webinar presented by RE100 and Enel Green Power. My name is Tessa Lee. I'm a senior manager for corporate engagement here at the Climate Group. And we're really thrilled to be hosting this convening today. We've got folks joining us from all around the world and from a number of different backgrounds. And we're joined here by 4 of our RE100 member companies, all of whom have achieved 100% renewable procurement for their electricity footprint in the United States. And we're here today to hear their stories, joined by my moderator, McGrail from Enel Green Power, who's going to take us through some questions as we hear from our members. We're thrilled to have Goldman Sachs, Microsoft, Swissfree, and Workday on the line. And just for everyone who might be joining from around the world less familiar, RE100 is a global network of 280 companies from around the world who have committed to sourcing 100% of their owned and operated electricity needs with renewable electricity around the world. Anyone who's an attendee, there's a chat box. If you have questions, we'll have some time to take questions from the audience in the end, so you can put those in the chat box. But for now, I'm going to once again thank everyone for joining us today and turn it over to Mark to get started. Mark, you're on mute, so you can unmute yourself and take it away. Thank you. One second, we're unmuting you. Mark,
all right.
There we go. Great. Thanks, everybody. Go ahead, Mark.
Hi, Tessa. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank everyone for joining us today on today's webinar. Welcome. To our panelists, I'd like to congratulate you on your contributions to your company's achievement of 100% renewable energy. Congratulations to all of you. As we all know, the success of the energy transition is contingent on openness and transparency. So I want to thank you all for taking the time today to share your stories with us. So let me introduce our first panelist, Cindy Quan. She's the Vice President and Chief of Staff in the Corporate and Workspace Solutions Group at Goldman Sachs. Cindy oversees the firm's environmental and social sustainability strategies and public policy initiatives. So welcome, Cindy. Thank you. And as you reflect on your journey to get to 100% renewable energy, who are some of the key stakeholders that you engaged with in order to get to this stage?
Cindy, you're also muted. Let me see. Rosie, can you send Cindy that unmute request? The joys of technology in the age of COVID. There we go, Cindy. Go ahead.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Tessa and team, for inviting me, and Mark for moderating this esteemed panel of colleagues. I would say for our journey, some of the key stakeholders, which I think will be very similar to my peers here, first and foremost was our senior leadership team within my division, as you mentioned, which is Corporate and Workplace Solutions. Our division is responsible for managing about 11 million square feet of the firm's corporate portfolio, as well as all of the associated workplace services that we provide to the people of Goldman Sachs, as well as our clients. First and foremost, it was this team that ultimately needed to come together, since we manage the firm's utility usage and ultimately the renewable energy purchases, to really understand, where our real estate portfolio was going, and our strategy that we were implementing to be able to reduce absolute energy usage in that portfolio. And then ultimately coming together in agreement with regards to how we were going to procure renewable energy, specifically in the US. The US is 60% of our global total energy use, and so a very large portion of our usage. And so that team was really the first team that came to the front lines to really understand what process we needed to undertake and ultimately what contracts we needed to sign. Secondly, once we actually got agreement and internal buy-in, I would say the other key stakeholder or senior leadership at the firm. We have an executive office where our sustainable finance team sits. They ultimately are the team that oversees all sustainable initiatives and activity at the firm. It was a joint partnership with that team to ensure that they were in line with the strategy that ultimately that we were going to procure and how we were going to procure renewable energy at the firm. And so it's ultimately reporting from the division up through the executive office of the firm. And then I would say lastly are our people, and ensuring that we educate our people. Our people are our greatest clients, and ultimately we wanted to ensure that from a recruitment and retention perspective, that we were enabling them with essentially all of the details that they needed to understand how the firm was actually committed to sustainability, and ultimately the steps that we were going to be able to take that covered our energy usage from a facilities perspective with renewable energy. And so I would say those three key stakeholders, our internal leadership team, the senior leadership team of the firm, and ultimately our people, were the key stakeholders that were part of this process.
Great, thank you so much. So now that's a lot of stakeholders. There's a lot of parties there. Were there any major challenges or lessons learned that that you'd want first-time buyers to be aware of? So I'm sure each one of those different committees or executive committees, there was a different level of buy-in, I'm sure. So how did you deal with all of that? What were some of those key challenges?
I would say some of the lessons learned, especially for first-time buyers, and I kind of recall, going back a couple of years when we were first-time buyers as well, is not to get too overly excited and eager to want to just focus on the transactional component. And to really be able to kind of focus in on the due diligence of understanding, one, not only the commitment to 100% renewable, why your firm is committing to 100% renewable, and then ultimately understanding and aligning that commitment with your firm's real estate footprint And probably more so importantly now more than ever in light of, kind of like this post-COVID work, is the evolving real estate strategy. I think sometimes not knowing how to go through the process, you end up just focusing on what are the different types of transactions that you can undertake in order to cover your portfolio, as opposed to actually understanding what the portfolio is and ultimately how it will evolve. With COVID and many of us ultimately working at home, that's ultimately kind of shaken up how we originally envisioned our real estate footprint and our strategy to evolve in the coming years. And I think this whole notion of future of work and how we need to enable flexible work, a lot of the consumption that used to be historically in buildings and in our data centers to support those buildings will now come into people's homes. And because of that, and the long-term kind of flexible work strategy, I think will ultimately very much change the landscape of how many of us corporates ultimately procure renewable energy. And so I would say that's definitely one of the first and foremost, and probably one of the key things that we want to be able to share that first-time buyers definitely really understand how that real estate strategy is going to change, how that consumption pattern is going to change, and also not forget that one of the first steps in the journey to procurement of renewable energy is really focusing in on the energy itself. And what I mean by that is the consumption component, because many of our firms also have energy efficiency and absolute reduction in energy commitments. And so to make sure not to forget about that component, that in the future, 5-10 years down the line, that the world and how it's going to look and the consumption directly in the offices will likely change, and change fairly drastically, especially with the flexible work environment.
Well, that's great. Thank you. Were there any innovative contract structures that you used to achieve your goals?
Absolutely, thank you. I think for us, we really kind of took a multi-pronged strategy for the bulk of the purchase in the Americas. We actually partnered with our commodities team to secure a long-term REC contract that aligns with our consumption in the US. We also partnered fairly early on, a few years ago, with Iron Mountain as an early adopter of their Green Power Pass program, in which Iron Mountain actually goes out and directly sources the renewable energy to cover our electricity consumption at their co-located data centers, which is a significant component of our load. And then also lastly, as part of our renewable energy journey, on-site renewable contracts also formulate a part of that strategy. And so I would definitely advise a lot of first-time buyers to look at different contracts that ultimately work in different markets and also in different regions and states where you have your consumption and your load.
Cindy, thank you so much. That was very, very helpful, very interesting. Thanks for sharing. I'd like to now take the time just to shift to another panelist. I'd like to introduce you all to Vanessa Miler-Fels. She's the Director of Energy and Innovation at Microsoft. Vanessa has over 12 years of global market experience in renewable energy procurement, and she's currently leading the innovation and impact team at Microsoft. So welcome, Vanessa, and congratulations.
Thank you, Mark.
And so your technology is working. That's great. So let me ask you, in your years of renewable energy procurement, are there any challenges or lessons learned that you'd like to share with first-time buyers here?
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Tessa, for putting this great panel together. I'm excited to speak here, and this is definitely a milestone. And I would very much echo what Cindy has talked about. There's a lot of factors that get mixed into a strategy, and that strategy will evolve as power markets evolve, as demand of energy evolve, renewable energy procurement evolves and gets more matured. I think an industry association in Europe has shared that there's more than 14 ways to procure renewables. Cindy has mentioned a few: on-site renewables, virtual PPAs, physical PPAs, direct investment, tax equity. Number. I don't even recall the 14 really, to be frank, but aggregated PPAs, and we're going to touch a number of these. But for us, it's also been a journey, and so we've definitely evolved our procurement over the years. We started in 2012 by becoming carbon neutral, and that means mainly relying on unbundled renewable energy certificates. And starting in 2013, we've added virtual PPAs to our portfolio and are now on track to be powered with 100% renewable energy globally in all of our locations for all of our facilities, campus and data centers with virtual PPAs by 2025. And the reason we made that shift is related to the impact we want to have on the grids that we operate in, and that concept of additionality that has been coined now almost a decade ago. But I think there's different flavors of green energy, and our CFO used to talk about minty green, and then I think there is the deep forest green, and we acknowledge that not all companies will get to the same shade of green, and that shade of green will evolve over time. And we expect that the shade of green that we account as the best standard today is not going to be the best standard of tomorrow, because the technology is going to change, because the cost curve of technologies we can't leverage today is going to change, because the data information we have access to is going to change, and so that's really I think that's the biggest challenge when defining a strategy, is kind of knowing that uncertainty and being comfortable with it. And I think at Microsoft we had a little bit of a privilege in the sense that we have an internal carbon fee, which is charged to all of our businesses, and based on the carbon footprint that these businesses are responsible for. So obviously our data center group as one of the largest tax or contribution to that carbon fee. And that carbon fee kind of serves as a benchmark for, okay, what's the cost of renewable energy procurement? What can Microsoft afford to spend on greening its data centers and facilities, which maybe other businesses, don't necessarily have that same kind of clear line of, okay, if I can get below that cost, it's all a benefit to our P&L at the end of the day. So that definitely helped, but one of the biggest challenges when doing PPAs is cost uncertainty and how to value the hedge efficacy of a deal. And I don't think we've yet invented the tools to be able to have a clear a clear cost over a 15-year period, which is typically or 10-year period, which is typically the time of a PPA, and that uncertainty of cost needs to be borne by the business and understood by executives. There's going to be ups and downs, and again, there's a lot of factors that goes into that.
Right. So you had mentioned the different types of, or different ways to go green in that article. Were there any innovative contract structures that you guys utilized in your journey? I mean, I'm sure you've seen a little bit of everything.
So certainly, and one key. I mean, I don't think we've seen everything. we're still hopefully inventing, but we've definitely tried to innovate and address some of the risk we've assessed, and we hope that we've identified most of the risk, particularly, I mean, the one I just mentioned, the cost, but even more than just the cost and uncertainty of markets. I mean, if it was just a one-to-one, that'd be a perfect hedge, and that'd be a perfect position. But it's really when the time and location of production of renewable energy is quite critical. And so I think a lot of you would be familiar with shape risk, and that's the one that we try to address by creating innovative structures, including volume firming agreements with Resurety and Allianz RTE. So working with reinsurers to try to smooth out a little bit the profile of renewable energy production, so that we would be less exposed to critical kind of spikes in production of the renewable energy products we're contracting from. And so we're, with the volume firming agreements, we putting the onus in terms of operation, management, and kind of production guarantees to the developer, and with the help of the reinsurer for a fixed price, rather than to Microsoft. So that it's it's a hedge on a hedge. So a lot of financial mechanism. I don't know if it is. The question is, how can we create innovative tools that make smaller buyers access renewable energy? And I think there's still a lot of innovation that I would expect on that front, and innovation coming from utilities. VFA can be maybe better handled by larger corporates or utilities. And so how do we simplify the contracting of renewable energy for smaller buyers? That's still something that we have a lot of work to do. And I would think for IR100, it's a good goal, given that we want to grow the number of companies that are committing to these goals.
I agree. Getting more and more people engaged, and then adapting these contracts to make them more flexible for the smaller buyers is important. Well, thank you for sharing that. Let me introduce the third panelist now, Mischa Repmann. He's a senior environmental specialist with Swissfree. Mischa is on the internal environmental management team at Swissfree, and he leads the CO2 net zero program and the renewable power sourcing strategy for Swissfree. So welcome, Mischa, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Pleasure to be here. It's a bit late. I'm calling from Zurich in Europe. Speaking about US, but Switzerland, Swissfree has a small kind of footprint, right? We are a global insurance company, reinsurer. So we are kind of big in dollars, but small in terms of consumption. And therefore, we don't have an explicit team of energy sources who are deliberately sourcing green power. But we thought we have to do something to leverage our impact, our willingness to buy impactful green power. And one of the first things we did is founding RE100. So in 2014, together with IKEA. That is a model that we are kind of trying to replicate as well with other good things, like greenhouse gas strategy and things like that.
Oh, that's great
to be here.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. It's so late in your day. So knowing that you're in Switzerland and you have a relatively small footprint here, was there, when you thought about approaching the market in the US, was there, how did you consider getting involved besides the RE100? Were there other things that you did when you started to collaborate with folks like IKEA in getting involved in the market? What were some of the things that you did?
Yeah, I think one of the early things we could do is think about what is impactful sourcing. And Vanessa, you're totally right, that will change over time. But back then, when we laid out that strategy, it was clear that we should build the stuff ourselves with the capital that we have at hand. There we have a problem. We just own so little of the offices that we occupy in the US, with having the headquarters in Zurich. We managed then to build in New York, north of New York, in Armonk, in our office, to build our own plant. So that was a success, number one. Then we said, well, second tier of impactfulness would be PPAs or VPPAs. So that was then the strand that we followed. And then the third would, of course, be to go on the secondary market and source some EACs. That's the strategy we apply all over. And in the US, we then could really go to the second tier and think of how we can, meaningfully enter a VPPA. And with our 40 gigawatt hours or so consumption worldwide, and I think some 15 back then in the US, it was clear that wouldn't qualify us to enter any meaningful negotiations with a decently sized utility scale asset. So aggregation was definitely the way we went then, and luckily we found, with the help of consultants and some folks that were more advanced than us, definitely in those structures, we found partners with Apple, Akamai, and Etsy, where we then could drive one of the first successful aggregations for a VPPA in the US pretty quickly. I think within 2 years we were finally there. There was some construction delay then, but overall it was it was a fun ride, say.
I'm sure. So being part of an aggregation, I'm sure there were a lot of challenges with so many interested parties in there. Were any lessons learned that you took away from that process?
Let me speak a bit from the perspective of the small buyer, right? If I tell you the percentage of the deal that we got in the end, you'll be astonished. It's not even 5%. So if you're a small buyer, look for a big buyer, and then you can kind of piggyback and learn from the big buyer who has done such deals already, and you can kind of learn from the contractual structures. Our legal counsel could do the learning. So it's no worth to be like 50 small buyers that put together their weight. It's good to have one big buyer and 2-3 smaller buyers, I'd say, to begin with. Then, I mean, Switzerland as well, Swissfree as well, we try to apply that knowledge in Europe. Unfortunately, we went to the UK and things got a bit nasty, so we couldn't close that deal with the UK and export the credits to Central Europe. But definitely the key to success was go to a big guy, learn from the big ones, don't reinvent the wheel. And then we didn't have to, it wasn't, that part of the story wasn't that rough, right? So it was a rather smooth, the whole aggregation. The problem was nobody thought of taking a financially regulated company in to that aggregation, that this is changing the perspective quite a bit, or say the efforts and whatever has to be done. So it's a derivative deal, a VPPA, and we figured after signing the contract.
Yeah.
That was the fun.
Great.
So in a nutshell, it means that my legal counsel or our team then said, look, we understand that you have written a derivative transaction and you're not allowed to do that as operational entity of Swissfree. So we have to, do now the whole drum beating, and we have to learn from that mistake. And so in the end, it was all good, but we had to get exempt from our derivative use framework and things like that. So it was really complicated in the end. The whole deal sits within asset management at Swissfree, which is the entity that can sign derivative deals. So they get the pain, but also the gain, kind of. While for the group, it works. The whole hedging philosophy behind the VPPA, the operational team doesn't really see. Then the asset management is kind of bearing the cost of last year, where power markets were really low, and our renewable power cost went up a lot thanks to the VPPA.
Yes, understood. Well, thank you so much for sharing that with me. I'm going to just transition now to Erik Hansen. He's the Senior Director of Environmental Sustainability for Workday. Welcome, Erik. He leads the company's global sustainability efforts, and he's responsible for the development and implementation of sustainable strategies across Workday's operations, which includes renewable energy procurement. So welcome, Erik, and congratulations on achieving 100% renewables.
Thanks, Mark.
So yeah, sure. Why don't I start with you and just ask you, how did you approach the market as well? Have you found any similarities to the other panelists' experience, or how did you go about things?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I hear a lot of our experience from each of the panelists, actually, and am actually honored to be on the panel with so many accomplished individuals in the renewable energy space. So Workday is very similar to Microsoft. Very early on, maybe 2008, 2009, decided to match 100% of our load in the US with unbundled RECs, essentially. And this is early days in the corporate renewable space, and that was the starting point for us. As we sort of further progressed and realized we wanted to make a more impactful procurement for Workday, we started getting really involved in the early iterations of what eventually became REBA, and started exploring other options. Very similar to what Mischa and Cindy were mentioning. We currently only own 3 buildings at our headquarters in Pleasanton, California. 80% of our load are in data center co-location providers. So we're leasing space, multi-tenant facilities. Don't control the contract for electricity. So as we sort of thought about how we were going to make more impactful procurement decisions here without the ability to meaningfully add on-site renewables for most of our buildings, we turned to a VPPA model as well and turned to aggregation. And so a couple of years ago, a handful of companies, 3 of which were RE100 members, I think all of which were Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance members. So Bloomberg, Gap, Salesforce, us, Workday, and Cox Enterprises got together and said, why don't we try to prove that smaller buyers can go out and do an aggregation deal where everybody takes a small load, and together we can, do a deal or be an anchor buyer for a project. So we did do that. Everybody took 10 megawatts or less. So the 5 buyers took collective 42.5 megawatts of a 100 megawatt solar farm, North Carolina. It's in PJM. For us, we took 10 megawatts of roughly 24,000 megawatt hours a year. That matches our load at our 4 data centers in Virginia. And those data centers are already leased space. So I think a lot of the same lessons learned for us that I'll reiterate from Mischa. What was beneficial for us is that Bloomberg and Salesforce had already done the PPAs before, so there were learning opportunities for us as a first-time buyer to really ask the right questions. Same internal stakeholders, accounting, legal, could learn from those buyers who had done deals previously, which is really beneficial. We could structure the contract so that it wasn't considered accounting for us, right? So that we can avoid that. So I thought that was really, really beneficial from an aggregation perspective. I do think it is possible, and what we tried to prove is that you can do small buyers collectively together to be the anchor buyer for a larger project. And I think increasingly as the cost, especially of solar, has come down, that's more and more a possibility where we don't have to necessarily find a large anchor buyer, one of the big boys. But I think Mischa's absolutely right that it does make it a little bit easier if you do find one of the hyperscale type of energy users and latch onto that if they're willing to do an aggregation with you.
That's great.
Yeah.
So sorry, sorry, did you want to add any more?
No, and that was sort of like where our journey really kicked off with more utility scale procurement.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing all those lessons learned, everybody. I really appreciate it. Why don't we now transition to more of a panel type conversation, and why don't I kick it off with, when you guys decided to move forward, and I think Vanessa, you touched on this. When you're evaluating your purchasing options, were there any metrics you used to evaluate the projects? And so I know, Vanessa, you mentioned the carbon pricing and things like that. Why don't I open it up? I'll transition back to you, Cindy, if that works. And did you guys have any particular metrics that you used to evaluate your projects?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, very similar to Vanessa, we also have an internal cost of carbon, and we apply that to all of our ROI models as we're looking at where to make our investments. So do we make our investments ultimately external to our facilities, or do we make the investments internal to our facilities to improve the efficiency of our office buildings? And ultimately, where we can turn off things, we want to be able to turn off first, because that doesn't actually require the investment. And then secondly, where we do need to make upgrades, whether it's lighting upgrades, whether it's chiller upgrades, we do apply the internal cost of carbon to understand if we were to go out and source an alternative method to be able to cover those emissions and also cover that consumption, would it be better for us to actually take that investment and make our buildings significantly more efficient. And that's one of the things that we've done historically since 2005, not only invest in our own facilities, but then also one of the biggest key strategies in our pursuit towards carbon neutrality is around consolidating our campuses. And so we look to move out of older legacy buildings, which are significantly more inefficient, and be able to consolidate our footprint in hub locations around the world in facilities that are significantly newer, whether they have BREEAM and or LEED certifications, to ensure that the kilowatt hour usage per square foot is significantly more efficient than some of the legacy buildings that we ultimately move over. And then ultimately we get into the, okay, so we're not going to turn the lights off in our buildings fully. So how do we cover the remaining components of those emissions? And so we go on a site-by-site basis where we can actually install on-site technologies. We look to do so. So specifically in the Americas, we brought online our first solar carport system in our ECO facilities, in our ECO headquarters, which is a 1.3 megawatt system. It was a first for us. It was definitely a learning process in working with the developer and understanding all of the nuances and actually bringing online a solar carport in upstate New York, where you have significant weather impacts to solar carports, not only orientation, but the design of the solar carports to ensure that we were maximizing the parking space, and then also ensuring that we could get over that 50% threshold with regards to on-site generation behind the meter. And so for that, it was sizing of the facility that we took into consideration, and then obviously not only the term length of when those carports and how long those carports would be there for, but then ultimately resulting in some of the additional features we had to add in that got added into our PPA cost. And then ultimately we kind of move up from the facility level to understand, you know, where in the majority of our facilities where we don't own, as Erik had mentioned, whether we lease the facility, we are in a multi-tenanted facility, what are some of the other options to be able to cover that usage with renewable energy, whether it's through a VPPA, whether it's through a retail sleeved PPA, so working directly with our utility providers, or whether it's the final option in being able to say that we have to go out and buy unbundled RECs. One of the things that we want to move towards as part of our 2025 commitment is actually signing up for long-term purchase agreements that cover 80% of our total global usage by 2025. And so 80%, you know, the majority, as I mentioned before, 60% of that will come from our US load. And then ultimately we will go around the world to be able to cover some of our larger regions with virtual power purchase agreements and or on-site development.
Interesting. Thank you. Thanks for sharing all that. Vanessa, I know you touched on the internal carbon pricing a little bit. Are there any other metrics that you used?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think, you know, ideally we want to develop tools that allow us to look at much more metrics than we are today. But we've already looked, and I think a number of us have mentioned various criteria that are factored in, how we optimize our portfolio and what type of renewable energy procurement we decide to go for. Additionality was mentioned, location was mentioned, cost obviously is top of mind for everybody. The carbon shadow or carbon fee price, which is a little bit different because carbon fee does impact the P&L, like they're already seeing the pain, so they have like a direct incentive to kind of change behavior. Whether we could go to something, you know, further. I think with the maturity of corporate procurement, and again, I want to make sure that the perfect is not the enemy of the good, but we do think we have a lot more to do. And so then the question is, how do we embark more companies on this journey while still kind of furthering more impact for the communities where we invest in and for the transition of the grid? But two kind of key levers that we really want to focus on in the coming years, and it's not going to be simple to solve, is going to be climate equity, and it's going to be carbon impact. Because the interesting thing is, so far we were focused on 100% renewable energy, and we were marching towards 100% renewable energy, and we were using market-based accounting rather to report our Scope 2 emissions. But last year we announced that Microsoft would be carbon negative by 2030. And this has changed quite dramatically how we're thinking about the data truth that supports all of our carbon accounting. And I think we all know here that a megawatt hour is a megawatt hour, but it does not displace the same amount of carbon depending where you put it, but not only where you put it, what time it comes online. And that information, being able to know that, is really what we want to be able to do. Today, we don't think we have the tools to get to that carbon truth, to be frank, in most markets. We don't get the information from the TSO, from the DSO, and we just equate that a megawatt hour is carbon zero, but that's not necessarily true. And so I think there's going to be a lot of work to do, not just as a single corporate. It's really, how do we bring this zero carbon grid to fruition, and that will require really everybody and all the stakeholders that everybody mentioned internally and externally to be able to deliver that vision. So, but at the same time, again, I don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. It's like every megawatt hour of renewable energy we're bringing on is getting us closer to that 100% carbon-free grid. It's just, can we create tools that helps us inform so that we reduce carbon the fastest? Like the carbon we can avoid today rather than tomorrow, that counts, because it does accumulate at the end of the day.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Mischa, do you have any thoughts on that? Any particular metrics that you use to evaluate did the aggregation use any particular metrics to evaluate the project that they ultimately selected to contract with? Oh, I think you're on mute.
We just really jumped to the occasion that was there. It's very cool what I heard, Vanessa, where you're going. I mean, that's just an accounting trick that we say renewable power is zero carbon, which is totally not true. We've been offsetting that with 20 grams per kilowatt hours ever since we procured that, because in Switzerland we buy hydropower a lot, and that's our biggest source, and that's really low. But I totally agree. We have to educate the world that renewable power is not carbon free for a long time to come, and that we have to tackle that somehow differently, right, by further decarbonization measures. I wanted to give it another twist, because internal carbon price is an interesting case here. You say that you have the price and it tells you how much you can buy, but many people or many corporates who don't have the price set yet are still buying green power already at some premium. And I think there we can just turn the story around and tell these people, hey, if you want to engage in the carbon pricing dialogue, you're doing it already. Just do the math, right? Figure how much carbon you displace by the green power that you buy for the premium that you pay, and there you are. You have your intrinsic or your implicit carbon price, and that's then the starting point that you can use to go to your board and tell them, we are doing internal carbon pricing, P&L active internal carbon pricing. Since a couple of years, that's our price, that is our basis to start a discussion, and then let's increase it to a level that is more impactful and meaningful. So that is something that I barely seen in the past, but I think it's a powerful communications tool to go to senior management, because often it's about, our bubble is doing a good job, the soldiers, but we don't really get to we may get to the top senior management. They say it's very good what you're doing, but there is a long way in between, the fields that you have to overcome and make the business case that this is something that you can achieve. So I think it's a perfect couple to marry the internal carbon pricing discussion and green power.
That's great. That's great. Erik, what are your thoughts? How was your aggregation? What did they use as a metric to evaluate the project?
Yeah, I mean, like everyone mentioned, we also use an internal price on carbon, and that's sort of the starting point for a lot of our goals. We hit a sort of self-defined net zero goal last year, and 100% renewable globally. And the way that we really achieve that is through an internal price on carbon, and going to our data centers, going to our facilities and saying, this is what it costs for you to do business. And hopefully setting that price high enough to incentivize them to reduce emissions, and then using that fee to do our procurement. So absolutely, when we evaluated that aggregate BPPA, we leaned really heavily on that internal price on carbon for that deal specifically was to address a data center load in Virginia. And we use that to model out some different scenarios to help illustrate the potential benefits of that particular deal. I think we also use that metric when we evaluate, very similar to what Cindy mentioned in multi-tenant colos. We use that when we go to an RFP to do our next data center that we're going to move into in a particular market. We're baking into that metrics like PUE of the data center, which anyone in the data center world will realize is an important metric. Understanding the efficiency of that data center, right? How much of the electricity at that site is going directly to the IT equipment versus overhead for cooling and other needs. And in that evaluation, we're baking in that internal price on carbon and helping say, data center provider A versus B. This is what it's going to cost us in carbon and cost us in having to go out and do renewable procurement. And if the provider is going out and leveraging some of the work that we did through REBA's Future of Internet Power to account for emissions appropriately, and then be able, if the data center provider is doing procurement of renewables themselves, we've put together a white paper through REBA's Future of Internet Power that helps them put the documentation they can provide to their clients or their customers so that we can take credit for the usage of those renewables, and so there isn't double counting. And so every single RFP that we issue for a new data center provider, it's baked right into the contract that we will use this framework if you're going out and doing procurement of renewables. Will you be supportive of that? And if they're not, then that comes with an increased cost premium. That's very real, and that gets surfaced all the way to the C-suite when we're making that decision on which data center provider to go with. So increasingly, we're making sure that those data center contracts have those metrics in there that influence the cost of energy and renewables, so that it's really crystal clear for our leadership and management. It's not just me on the side doing this in the sustainability silo.
Right. Well, that's a great way to just incorporate it right from the get-go. Just keep an eye on the time here. I'm gonna, Erik, if you don't mind, I'll stay with you. And now that you've achieved 100% renewables, what's next for you guys?
Yeah, great question. So I mentioned, we only own 3 buildings. We built our first new construction building for our headquarters in Pleasanton, California, a couple years ago. The parking structure of that has an 865 kilowatt solar array. We're looking to add more renewables to the buildings that we own. I think on-site generation, where it makes sense, just should be the starting point. But then for us right now, we have data centers in regulated markets where we don't have utility scale like BPPA options in those regulated markets. And so how do we address that? I think to Vanessa's point, we're really looking at, what are we really trying to accomplish here? Are we trying to decarbonize the grid? Well, perhaps if we're in regulated markets, we should do our next deal in a grid region that is high carbon, that's high fossil fuel penetration, such that we can attempt to measure using tools like watt time the trade-offs in carbon and air pollution potentially between project A and project B. And then maybe layering on some social justice metrics on there as well, economic opportunity, and putting that bundle together into a set of metrics that are not just, cost of renewables, full stop, and volume of renewables. And so we're looking at our next deal and really looking at that deal with that lens. And so we're really hopeful that, maybe in the next year or two, we'll be able to announce something that's really, really focused on carbon impact and social justice, and not just purely on the size and economics of the deal.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing. Mischa, why don't I transition to you? What's next for you guys at Swissfree?
Yeah, quality before quantity is certainly good, and geographies, tackling different geographies. I mean, there is a lot to do in the US, arguably, definitely. Hopefully, with the new administration, not so much anymore. But for us, it's also a question that we get in other world regions to that same level of quality. And that isn't that easy. So as said already, like 2 years of negotiation, a VPPA in UK for continental Europe load was a nightmare, and then they just busted a day before signing, and luckily it busted because it would have been a complete mess. And then not speaking about all these scattered markets in Southeast Asia, and or not being able to be RE100 in Korea still, which is fun fact, right? So I agree with Erik definitely that we should not go and answer the easy questions, but answer the difficult questions now, those who have reached the 100%, and be inspiring in that respect. So for us, just as a practical issue, what is really also on the table is the landlord-tenant issue. I think there we are far away from a one-click away solution where we can really do impactful things. But I'm not here to propose something that really works for everyone. We managed to find an individual solutions in Bangalore, but that can be very different in other buildings and in other situations with other landlords, and not everybody's as cooperative. So,
Right. Thank you. Thanks for sharing. Vanessa, I'll transition to you.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I think
yeah, go ahead.
Erik and Mischa I've said really some of the things that are top of mind. We'll continue to focus on social equity, and we announced last year a 500 megawatt portfolio in PJM with Sol System, our renewable energy team, really kind of innovated to kind of allocate a portion of the funds that basically we'll be spending via the PPA on this portfolio to community renewable siting, and we've engaged with a number of organizations representing these communities to determine who should get access to the funding, and that's going to be an ongoing dialogue and an ongoing process. Again, I mean, as I said, I think these the two topics that I mentioned, climate justice or rate, social justice, and carbon truth. There's just so many layers, so many data components that we'll have to be humble about how we approach it, and making sure we continue to learn and listen, because we'll maybe make some mistake along the way, very likely. And I like that a number of us here shared some mistake that have happened over the last 5-10 years of renewable energy procurement. That's really great to see that transparency. And then the other piece, obviously, I mentioned that Microsoft will be carbon negative by 2030, or is committed to be carbon negative by 2030, and that includes our Scope 3 emissions. And so that means for us really working really deep with our overall value chain, both upstream and downstream. But obviously, upstream is our supply chain, and that's challenging. So I'm not bringing a solution here. How are we going to decarbonize our supply chain with renewable energy or energy efficiency? But that's certainly something that we're focused on and want to figure out innovative ways to engage with suppliers where our supply chain manufacturers are located, which is not necessarily in countries as easy as the US to procure renewable energy, or not with the same volume or capacity of renewable energy, and without necessarily the same pricing or legal regulatory framework structures. So this comes with some interesting challenges.
There's definitely a lot of work there.
Exactly. So welcome any sidebar conversation to kind of come up with great ideas there. But.
Great. Thank you so much. And last but not least, Cindy, what's next for Goldman?
So completely agree with what Vanessa just mentioned around Scope 3 and supply chain emissions. I think the emerging topic around, how can we go beyond our operational consumption and actually incorporate additional renewables into each of our supply chains without double counting, because all of us ultimately at the end of the day are probably all connected somehow in each other's supply chain. So I think that's definitely something that, is going to take, a force ultimately collectively to be able to understand how do we actually do that. And then the other area and topic of focus for us is specifically around diversity in our supply chains. I think, COVID shed a lot of light with regards to small businesses, women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses. And so for us, we have a public target out there to increase that diverse spend by 50% by 2025 off of what we will be disclosing for 2020. But I think what we've historically seen in the energy space is that there is a lack of diversity in that supply chain with regards to where we can and whom we can source from. And so it's going to be a huge effort on, a lot of the buyer's perspective to really understand how can we incorporate additional components of small businesses into the energy supply chain, where it's been historically regulated and also very much dominated by the public utilities.
Yeah, agreed.
Mark, can I chip in here just with one more comment?
Absolutely, please do.
Because the scope 3 issue is a big one, right? And that's rightfully something that we have to turn to as well as leaders or as pioneers. But let's not forget as well that it's not only the supply chain. I mean, Vanessa, you said it's the value chain, it's also downstream. And often that isn't getting as much attention now on the leaders. And I think that's an important one, especially, Cindy, for us in the financial sector, right? So all of us with our businesses and our business model, not us in operations, but the business model behind our corporate, we should think of how we can spur renewables, spur the journey to net zero, and really decarbonize the economy.
Thank you for that. Well, I just want to take a minute just to thank all of you. I thought this was a great panel. I thought the conversation was fantastic. I really appreciate you guys taking the time today to share your insights and what's next for you guys. So thank you, and I guess I'll turn it over to you, Tessa, for the final word.
Yeah, thanks so much. We've been live tweeting this event, so I've been here sort of frantically typing away and transcribing all the great insights we've heard from our panelists. I was commenting to Mark before the event, we have, as is one of the reasons why I love working for RE100, we have very diverse companies in terms of the sectors you're working in, the geographies where you're working in, your size, and then we heard so many commonalities. Erik and Mischa both pursuing VPPAs, Vanessa, and you were mentioning reinsurance, and then we've got Swissfree on the line, everyone looking at scope 3, looking at landlord-tenant issues, everyone. Cindy, you mentioned data centers first, not even the two software companies and tech companies on the phone. And then everyone has flashed on social justice and climate justice as one of the next steps. So it's always so inspiring to see all those commonalities, and I really appreciate these sorts of forums that can allow us to maybe hear from this diverse sorts of perspectives and see where actually we're all working together on similar things. So we have been live tweeting this event. We also, RE100, the climate group, published a blog post this morning. We have a full 38 of our member companies representing 12 terawatt hours of consumption who have achieved 100% electricity in the United States. So you can find more details about all of their journeys online there. The recording of this webinar will also go live on the website here shortly this afternoon. And this webinar was so great because everyone here has achieved 100%, but it's so clear that is now step one, and how much more work there is to do, and how engaged we all are, and to hear about how all of these different major corporates are doing it, and to have these smart minds thinking about it and working on it helps me sleep at night. We had some questions come through in the chat box from the audience. Apologies that we didn't get to those, but we are publishing part 2 of the article, looking at specifically, now that we've achieved 100%, what's next. So really writing up some of the conversation that we've had today and some other insights that were shared from more of our companies who were at 100% in the United States. So look for that on Thursday, and we'll speak to some of the questions from the chat box there in that article. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today from around the world, for all of your insights and all your hard work. We really appreciate it. Thank you, Mark, for moderating such a great discussion.
Thank you, guys. Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Have a great week.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye.
Thanks for inviting us.